I'll try to keep the beard still while I talk. My name is Nathan, and I'm here to talk to you today about Django Forms and try and give you sort of plumb some of the depths of the package. I'm a senior software engineer at Eventbrite, and as part of my work there over the past year, I've been building Django applications that had used forms very extensively, and I thought I kind of knew what I was doing when I started working on those projects, and then I realized I didn't. And so I'm here to hopefully share some of what I learned with you. There's a little bit of poor planning with this talk because I labeled it a deep dive but didn't label it extreme, and it's a 30-minute slot, so I apologize if some of it is fast, and yeah. The problem with a deep dive in 30 minutes is sometimes you hit your head on the bottom. So that's what I'm going to try to avoid. But right. So it's probably useful to think about a little bit of context and some basics around forms. And in particular, what I've found when I started working with forms was that it was not always obvious to me where they fit in the stack of Django. I sometimes would think of them as output tools and sometimes think of them as processing tools. And I sort of came to have this belief that really a form converts input to Python objects and Python objects to input opportunities for users. And those two things are actually pretty independent from one another. You can use forms in situations where you actually have no HTML form at all, and they're actually really useful in that situation because you're taking input from the user and you want to make sure that it's valid, that it meets your expectations, and forms give you a nice way to do that. So I just want to quickly provide a little bit of context and then move into some of the weeds, if you will. So I'm assuming everybody here has seen forms, and so this is just a refresher. If that's not true, then we can talk afterwards, and I can try and explain things to you a little bit in more depth. But forms are simply classes that are composed of fields, and each field has a widget. If you don't tell it what the widget's going to be, Django will give you one by default. So in this case, I have a contact form that has a name and an email address, and I've overridden the widget that's going to be used for the name, but not for the email address, so I'll get the default. You instantiate a form either with or without data. These are these are referred to unbound and bound forms. And a lot of times you'll see the upper format where you don't give it any keyword arguments as what you do when you're just rendering the form for output. And the second is when you're actually processing the post from the user, processing some amount of data. We usually see this written as request.post here when we're instantiating a bound form, but really it's any dictive data. So that could come from a JSON post, it could come from a payload of something else. It's one of the more flexible parts about forms. So when you've instantiated your form, there's actually, I'm sure this is well documented and I just wasn't paying attention, but there's actually two different ways to get out this field in the form. One of them is the fields dictionary, which actually gives you back those field objects. And so if you want to do things like modify the labels, modify the choices after you've started, that's where you go. But the second one, where you're actually saying form and square brackets of field name, gives you a bound field class. And a bound field wraps the field and the value and the widget so that you can output it to the user in different formats. You can give forms initial data. This is no surprise, I don't think. You can get sort of starting points at the dictionary of your field names. And something that you wind up wanting to do pretty often is output what that value is in your HTML or some other format. So the bound field gives you a value method that gives you the current value, either from the initial data or from the what input you're processing. So that's sort of a very high-level overview of forms and sort of the really basic stuff. And so now I want to dive into validation in depth and how this validation process works, because this is where I started to find things that I wasn't really aware of, or not until they bit me. So validating a form has two major steps. you validate the fields by themselves, and then you validate the form as a whole. You can trigger this in a couple different ways. By calling isValid will do it implicitly. Calling full clean does it explicitly. But each of these steps is somewhat independent of the other. So when we go in field, when we're doing field validation, we're actually doing a couple of different things. We're taking the data that we might have from the user and converting it into a Python object. So if I have an integer field and I get back the string, the number 3 in a string, the first step is going to be casting that to an integer and making sure that cast actually works, followed by running validators and then finally cleaning it. So any of these can raise exceptions along the way, and I'll show you how those get exposed out for output a little bit later. So validation, validators, you get some of them by default on a form, on a field, and some things like min value or max value you might want to assign to a field as a validator. And these are any callable that just takes the value and raises an exception if there's a problem with it. So these are useful just for basic validation and basic constraints on your information that's coming from the user. Cleaning is actually used when you want to do something a little more involved. It's a method on the form, and so it has the special name clean underscore field name. So in this case, it'd be clean underscore email or clean underscore name. It's a method. And so your input's already been converted. You can still raise validation errors, but these methods must return the validated, the cleaned value. So here's an example where I have my contact form, and I don't consider hotmail.com addresses valid. So, I could write this as a validator, but this is a clean example. So, I have the clean email method. I get the email out of cleaned data. Cleaned data is the dictionary that gets constructed as validation occurs, and the values are processed. They get added into this dictionary. I check if it ends with hotmail.com, and if it does, I raise this validation error. Then at the end, if I get all the way through here, I still have to return the actual value from the dictionary. And this is what winds up in cleaned data for the next step. So one other thing to note here is that if this is not a required field, for example, I might not have this key in my cleaned data dictionary, or it might have been an empty value before, and so using the get access actually winds up being a lot safer in most cases, giving it some sort of sane default. Once the field validation is completed, we actually validate the form as a whole, and there's this clean method that probably everybody has used who's worked with forms a little bit, lets you do things that interactions between two different fields or more than one field. And the errors that are raised by this method aren't associated with a particular field by default, so they're grouped into these non-field errors. And an example of this might be if you want to require people to confirm their email address when they put it in. You can't write this as a validator because you need access to both of those fields. And the clean email method I showed you, you can't assume you have any other fields at that point. It's really only about that particular field. So this example just gets the email and the confirm email value and raises an error if they aren't equal to each other. Again, this has to return what is going to wind up in cleaned data at the very end in order for that to work. So I mentioned that there's an initial data that you can give a form. This is not the same as default data, so it might wind up coming back as a default from the user if you're doing HTML forms, but just the fact of specifying it as an initial data does not populate it as cleaned data default. So it's safer when you're doing these accesses to make sure you specify what you expect the default value to be. Something I found really useful as I started working on larger form projects that I didn't know was there initially was these has changed and changed fields. So changed fields actually winds up giving you a list of all the fields that have changed from their initial values. which is pretty handy, especially when you're writing something that's CRUD, like a CRUD application. You want to provide an edit interface. It's handy to know what fields have changed, or if you want to show specific messages, that sort of thing. The other thing you can do that's kind of interesting is you can add the show hidden initial equal true to a field definition. And then when you render it, you're going to actually get two different inputs. You're going to get the real input, and you're going to get the hidden input that gets used, that has the initial value in it. That can be used, if you have a reset button on your form and you want to do some JavaScript to just set things back to the initial values, or if we use it occasionally where the initial value we start with, we don't want things to be flagged as changed, and so we actually want to sort of slip a different initial value in there when it comes back. And it's a slightly evil application, but it actually works really well when you have multiple things that are interacting with one another. So it lets you impact the way the processing happens. So testing forms is something that I found really useful. It's not clear to me whether these are unit tests or system tests or integration tests, but I do find them really useful to test the behavior that I expect to happen. And they're also really useful for me in remembering or in making sure my forms are kind of doing the right amount of work. So if you remember what I assert that forms are for, which is taking input and turning it into Python objects, that sort of guides you about what you might want to be testing, what sort of situations and states are useful to test. Things like initial states, making sure that certain cases that you expect to be invalid really are invalid could be useful. My experience has been that testing forms should be pretty straightforward and pretty easy. And the cases where I've really struggled with it, I've been able to step back and realize, oh, my form is probably not actually constructed very well. It probably is trying to do too much, or depending on another part of the system too heavily. So I really encourage people to write tests for forms because it kind of gives you a check on cohesion. So the tests are pretty. This is a simple test that just tests our contact form and tests that giving it a name that's way too long is really going to be invalid. So I constructed my dictionary of test data here, and this would this is basically substitute. This is would come from the post, if you're actually in a real request situation. Pass it in, just assert that it's not going to be valid. So you can see that for a small form, this is pretty straightforward. But for a larger form, you can imagine there's this could get pretty tedious, writing all these fields out and writing out all of the different initial values. So we actually have a library that we split out from our code base and just released this morning on GitHub called Rebar, and Rebar makes your forms stronger. And there's a testing part of that has some helpers in it. One of them is called flatten to dict, and it can take a form or a form set, we'll talk about later, a model form, and basically it just takes the current state of it and flattens it out to a dict, so that if you have a very large form you're working with, this gives you a snapshot of your initial state, and so all you have to do is update then the values you're actually interested in for writing the test. One of the promises of using a framework like Django is that it's going to do a lot of things for you. It's going to make your life easier, make it easier to get started, and get things moving really quickly. And I think forms are a big part of that in terms of rendering HTML. As somebody who's primarily a back-end person, my CSS skills are almost non-existent. So, my HTML skills are not much better. So I really like having these starting points. But eventually, if you're lucky enough to have your project live long enough, you're going to need to do things that are maybe not exactly how they're prescribed out of the box. And so I want to run through a few things that we found really useful in terms of starting points, and then how to take advantage of Django forms for rendering when it's not just the stock situation. So. First of all, a plug for class-based views. I know this is not a class-based views talk, but I just want to say that if you're trying to implement something that has the typical get, post, redirect behavior, that the class-based views make this dead simple, because all you do is give it a form class where you want to go afterward, and then you can do something when it's valid or invalid, but you don't even need to do that if you don't want to. So a plug for class-based views, learn it, live it, love it. So there's three whole form output modes you can call that are kind of boring, but they're useful for your first pass. There's as, p, as, ol, and as table, and those perform about like you'd expect them to. You know, as table gives you table rows with each of your fields in it. That's great. But more often you're going to want to do things like iterate over them and apply your own HTML or your own layout. So you can iterate over the form like you'd expect to, and you'll get these bound fields back that have the values. You can call, there's a label tag method. There's calling the field, or representing the field itself gives you the actual widget. And then there's this field.errors, and field.errors is populated from the validators and the clean field methods we saw earlier. So when you're showing a form for the first time, it's going to be empty, so that you won't see anything there. But this gives you a way to show your users what's going on. And then there's the non-form errors. Actually, this should probably be non-field errors. It's probably a bug in my slides. But this is the additional errors that occurred during clean. So there's actually a few libraries that are available. One called Crispy Forms and one called Django Form utils that provide some base classes for your forms that actually make some of this even easier, where it's going to apply something. There's a one that works, a rendering that works with Twitter Bootstrap really well. So there's a really rich ecosystem around making this easy for developers to render things. So you can further. So there's I want to touch on a couple ways you can further customize rendering. I told you about how you can override the widget when you declare a field. You can also give it some adders. So if you just need to apply a particular class to the input, that's pretty easy. One I didn't know about was this error CSS class and required CSS class that you can find on the form itself that's going to apply those CSS classes to all the fields in your form. So when they have errors, they will get the error state, and when they're required, they'll get the required class. And that's pretty handy when you're outputting the widgets. The form.errors part of it, by default, is going to, well, I'm sorry. So the validators we saw have error messages. So for a required field, you might have this field is required. That might not be what you want to show. So there's this error messages dict. All the built-in Django validators have keys associated with the messages. And I believe they use that for localization, but you can also override it, so you can give it your own field-specific error message for that particular state without completely rewriting the validator or copying and pasting it. So the field.errors, where you're showing those errors, those are actually wrapped in a class that I wasn't really aware of this until I've been working with them for quite a while, because you never really have to see it. You can iterate over the errors if you want to. You can sort of get at them individually, but at the heart there, this error list output that is iterable, and it uses an unordered list as the tag for outputting it. But instead of iterating over them yourself to re-render them, you can actually specify your own error class that handles how you wrap the errors up for rendering. So this is an example where I wrote a sort of an arbitrary one that subclasses error list, but adds an as paragraphs method to it that gives me back my error messages in paragraphs as opposed to an unordered list. And then when I cast this to a Unicode, I call as paragraphs as opposed to as UL. So this is a way you can you can write a piece of code, write a class that you pass into your field definitions, and sort of define it in one place and reuse it throughout your application and throughout your forms so that you have consistent output. It's hopefully easier for people to style when it comes out. One other thing you might run into is when you have multiple forms on a page, maybe you have a search form as well as something else, and you want to ensure that things are not, or you want to have some greater confidence that the inputs will not collide and you'll get the right input for your form. There's a prefix keyword arg you can pass in when you can construct the form, and it just, you see my contact was the prefix, and so it gets added to both the ID and the name when I render this form. So this is actually used by other parts of Django under the hood for like form sets and form groups, or for form sets. We use it for form groups as well, which we'll talk about in a bit. Thank you. There's model forms. I'm actually going to skip these right now because I'm just saw my time card. But basically, they're like forms, but my one plug for model forms is forms take input and turn it into an object. Model forms just happen to turn it into a model instance as opposed to some other class. That's really helpful. But if you use them in a situation where you're maybe working with different models or working with different multiple copies of a model, might not be exactly what you want. So they're a good starting point for that, but and I'm actually, so form sets give you a way to put multiple copies of a form on a particular page, and these actually was really useful, especially when you want to edit like multiple contact records, multiple of anything. The one trick is there's this management form that has some additional information. You have to have that when you're processing, or it will not work. That keeps track. That does some accounting for you. Total number of forms, that sort of thing. And they basically have the same validation structure where you loop over the forms on what I talked about earlier. And then there's this form set clean at the very end. So here, for example, I have one where you can't have any names that are the same in a set of contact forms. So here we kind of keep track of them, and we raise an exception if any duplicate names occur. Flatten to dict works just fine for these. This is actually one of the places that's really helpful if you're trying to test a form set. And there's also an empty form data helper that will generate a new one for you, a new copy of the inner form for you. So when you're testing it, that rebar has a couple things that can be really helpful there. Right, so you can localize things. This is awesome. If you're doing international work, use L10N is great. It makes things like this work so that you have a date form that has a date, localized. PyCon ends on the 15th is true. On the 15/3, that's not valid. But when I turn on the UK, it is valid. So this is actually super helpful for things like dates and numbers where that we're not all in the US. So forms are just syntactic sugar. Dynamic forms are actually really easy once you know this. Just modify the fields property after init, under init finishes. So we have a way in rebar that you can validate for different states. I'm not going to talk about it much because I'm about out of time, but this is actually helpful when you have things that are required to get from one state to another, but you want to let people save in between. So here you can see it's valid, yes, but is it valid for publishing? No. And there's actually errors for this. So I'm happy to talk to people afterward about that in particular. That's the end. All these slides are available at that URL, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi. I was wondering if you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to create your own custom widget because maybe you had, a particular markup that you needed, and what your experiences was with that.
Yeah, so we have done custom widgets, or had to do custom widgets in the past, and I find it helpful to first try and figure out if I can just subclass one and change. Maybe if I don't want to rewrite the adders, for example, in every case, or customize the keyword args that it lets me do out of the box, you might consider subclassing it and making those the defaults. There's actually not a whole lot of magic to writing widgets, especially if you have a base one that you can start with. And the Django forms, some of the forms package, like the form sets and the model form sets, there's meta classes involved, and they're kind of magical. Well, they take a little bit of inspection, but the fields and widgets actually are pretty straightforward if you go look at those. So it's pretty easy to do.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have a question about integrating Django Forms with Backbone.js for dynamic JavaScript. Do you have any suggestions or ideas? 'Cause that's kind of a challenge for us.
Can you say more about what the challenge is?
For example, in using an underscore templating system, how do you get your forms on the page properly? Just ideas on how we can work around problems like that.
I actually have next to no experience with Backbone, but a colleague of mine who is here does, and maybe he would be willing to chat with you a little bit after, and because he worked on some projects with me on forms, and so he could probably answer that better than I can after the talk.
All right, great, thanks.
I was wondering, do you have any suggestions for testing forms with file uploads?
No, I don't.
Don't do it?
Don't do it.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, I've not had to do a lot of file upload work, so that's actually a sort of a blind spot in my forms knowledge. But yeah, I guess seems like you just about have to have do some extensive faking or mocking to give it the data that it expected to test the validation.
Just give it here's a file in my fixtures, and I want to see if I can trigger any extra validation and see what Django ends up doing with the file?
I don't know. That would actually be really interesting. That'd be really interesting to try and see if there's or what the pain points actually are, because I've never actually tried it, so I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much.